Montana Territory, 1887. The town had made up its mind about Lorene years ago. She was the schoolteacher, the quiet one, the woman whose husband had heard the doctor's words and decided he'd rather be somewhere else. The town knew, and knowing had curdled into deciding, that her story was already written, her place already fixed on the edge of everyone else's life. She had accepted it. Chin up, heart locked down, 4 years of getting on with things. She had stopped expecting anything to change. Then, on a cold Saturday in March, in the dust of the main street, a lean, quiet cowboy with no land and no name reached into his vest pocket and knelt down.
The snow came early that year. It came like the town's opinion of Lorene Halsey, uninvited, settling over everything, refusing to melt. She was 34 years old. She taught arithmetic and letters to other people's children 5 days a week. She mended her own fence, kept her own garden, carried her own water. She had learned, in the 4 years since Daniel Halsey packed a bag and didn't look back, to need very little from anyone. The town gave her plenty of nothing to work with. Brian McGee had been in Caldwell Creek 8 months when people stopped waiting for him to leave. He wasn't much to look at. Lean where other men were broad, quiet where they were loud. He worked Harlan Pruitt's ranch for fair wages and kept to himself in a way that made people uneasy, because a man with no land and no name and no apparent ambition was either hiding something or had already given up. Caldwell Creek hadn't decided which. Probably never would. What Caldwell Creek didn't know, what it never bothered to find out, was that Brian McGee noticed things. Small things. The loose step outside the schoolhouse that caught a heel wrong every icy morning. The woodpile at the edge of Lorene Halsey's property, good stock but split too thick to catch fast in a cold stove. The way she carried water from the well with her left hand favoring, the right wrist wrapped in cloth she thought nobody noticed. He noticed. He didn't say anything about any of it. He just fixed the step one evening in November, split her wood finer one morning in December before the sun came up, and left it stacked and covered without a word to anyone. Lorene had stood at her door that first morning, boot pressed to the solid step, testing it. She'd stood there long enough that her coffee went cold. By December, she knew who to thank. She left a jar of apple preserves on the fence post at the edge of Pruitt's property instead. Set it down, walked away, didn't look back. The jar was gone by morning. That was how it started. That was how it went for 2 months. Small things offered, small things accepted, nothing spoken aloud, because some things are too careful to survive being named too soon. Lorene had told herself the story so many times it had worn smooth. The baby that didn't come to term, the doctor's face after, the words he used, unlikely, damage, I'm sorry, Mrs. Halsey, words she had absorbed standing up, because sitting down felt like surrender. Daniel holding her hand in the buggy ride home, and then 6 months later, not holding anything of hers anymore. She didn't blame him. That was the part people found unsettling when she said it. She had loved him, and he had loved her, and neither of them had been strong enough for what the loss asked of them. It had broken something between them that neither one knew how to name, let alone repair. She had mourned that, too, quietly, alone, in the way she did most things now. The town's pity came dressed as concern, which was the cruelest kind. Invitations that stopped arriving. Conversations that shifted when she entered a room. The particular silence of women who had decided your story was finished while you were still living it. Lorene Halsey had decided, somewhere in the long winter of her 32nd year, to want less. It was cleaner that way, less to lose. Then Brian McGee fixed her step without being asked and ruined the whole arrangement. The church social in March was Mabel Fitch's domain the way the whole town was Mabel Fitch's domain, by default, by persistence, by the simple fact that no one had ever successfully told her otherwise. Lorene watched from across the room, watched Mabel take Brian's arm with the practiced grip of a woman accustomed to redirecting people and steer him toward Delia Marsh, 19, rosy-cheeked, the kind of girl a town decides is suitable before she's had any say in the matter. Brian stood politely, listened politely. His eyes moved once across the room, found Lorene, stayed at a breath too long. She looked away first. She was practiced at that. The room was warm and loud and full of the particular performance of a small town enjoying itself. Lorene kept her cup in her hand, and her expression pleasant, and her feet pointed toward the door in case she needed them. She heard Mabel from 6 feet away. Voice lowered, not lowered enough. Such a shame about Lorene. She would have made someone a fine wife. But what can you do? Some women just aren't meant for a family. The room kept moving. The music kept playing. A man laughed loudly at something near the window. Everything continued the way everything always continued, indifferent, rolling forward, leaving her exactly where she stood. Lorene set her cup down, carefully, excused herself to no one, walked to the side door, and threw it into the cold. The street was empty. The sun was already dropping, painting the dust in shades of amber and rose, the kind of light that made even Caldwell Creek look like somewhere worth staying. She stood at the edge of the boardwalk and breathed the cold air in slowly and let it do its work. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in 14 months, and she was not going to start on a church social Saturday over Mabel Fitch, who wasn't worth the salt. The door opened behind her. She knew his walk, the particular weight and pace of it. She had not meant to learn it and had learned it anyway, the way you learn things you're trying not to want. Brian McGee came to stand beside her, left a foot of space between them, just present, the way he always was, steady and unhurried, like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that patience was the only currency worth spending. You should go back inside. She kept her voice even. Delia Marsh is pleasant company. He looked at the empty street. I don't want pleasant company. Brian, Lorene. Just her name, quiet and complete. She made the mistake of turning to look at him, or the gift of it. She still hadn't decided which. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a word for. It wasn't pity. Pity she knew. Pity she could handle. Pity she had built good walls against. This was something else entirely, something that took in the whole of her, the loss and the long years and the careful, composed face she wore over all of it, and didn't look away from any of it. I know what they say. His voice was low. Pruitt's wife told him in November. He told me. Lorene's chin came up. Then you know why this... I know why you think this is a short conversation, a breath. You're wrong about that. She opened her mouth, found nothing. Brian reached into his vest pocket. His hand came out holding something small, a ring, plain silver, no ornamentation. Simple as everything about him, he had been carrying it long enough that this felt nothing like impulse. It felt like the opposite of impulse, like a decision made once in private and then quietly made again every day since. He knelt in the dust of the main street, right there, in the open. Anyone stepping out of the church social could see him, and she knew it, and he knew it, and he knelt anyway. Lorene's hands came up to her face, both of them, without permission, without warning. 4 years of arranging her expression into something manageable, and here she was, completely undone on a cold March street by a lean, quiet man in the dirt. "I have no land worth speaking of." Brian's voice didn't waver. "Wages, a fair reputation with horses, and not much else. This town would count for anything. I know you don't need saving. You've been running fine without me, and you'd keep running fine without me." He paused. "Let that sit. But I'd like to stop leaving things on fence posts and start just being there, if you'll have me." He held the ring up. "Lorene Halsey, I'm asking." The side door swung open. Mabel Fitch stepped out, already scanning for someone to redirect. She stopped. Her hand stayed on the doorframe. Behind her, others filled the gap. Delia Marsh, Pastor Greaves, the Whitmore sisters from the quilting circle, all of them still, all of them watching a no-account ranch hand kneel in the main street dust with everything he had and everything he didn't have laid out plainly in front of the woman the town had already written off. Lorene didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on Brian, on this man who had learned the weight of her wrist wrap, the thickness her wood pile needed, the particular sound her step made when it caught wrong, who had fixed things without being asked and wanted nothing for it, who was kneeling in cold March dirt because apparently that was just the kind of man he was. Her hands came down from her face. She was crying. The cold made it plain. "They'll talk," she said, and her voice came out unsteady for the first time she could remember in years. The corner of his mouth moved. "They talked before I knelt down. Doesn't seem to have stopped either of us getting here." From the doorway, one of the Whitmore sisters reached for the other's hand. Neither of them seemed to notice they'd done it. Old Agnes Pruitt, 80 years old, sharp as a field knife, not given to sentiment or silence, pushed past Mabel Fitch and stepped out onto the boardwalk. She looked at Brian in the dust. She looked at Lorene's face. She looked at the ring catching the last of the amber light. "Well," Agnes said, "to everyone and to no one. About time somebody did." Lorene laughed. It came out of her like something that had been waiting a long time for permission, full and startled and real, and Brian's face broke open in answer, younger than she'd ever seen it, unguarded, the long quiet of him suddenly and completely gone. She reached out her hand. He put the ring on, stood, didn't make a production of it, just stood close with her hand held in both of his and looked at her the way he always had, like she was something that deserved to be handled with care. "All right then," Lorene said. "All right," Brian answered. Behind them, for the first time in recent memory, Mabel Fitch had nothing to add. They married in May, when the ground had softened and the air smelled like everything starting over. The schoolhouse filled with wildflowers the children brought without being asked, jars and tins and one ambitious bouquet in a coffee pot, crammed into every windowsill until the room looked like a field had moved inside. Brian had 12 acres east of town by then, not much by any measure, enough by everyone that mattered. The boys came in August, brothers. Theo, 9 years old, and Kit, 7, whose mother had died of fever in June and whose father had looked at 2 small grieving faces and found himself unable to stay. The county had written letters. Lorene had read one letter and gone to Brian the same evening. He had listened to everything she said. Then he'd gone out to the barn and come back 20 minutes later with measurements for a second bed frame written on the back of a feed receipt. That was Brian. That was how he answered things. He built the bed himself, measured twice, sanded every edge until there wasn't a splinter to be found. He was meticulous about it in the way he was meticulous about everything that mattered, quietly, without announcement, until the thing was done and done right. Theo followed Brian around the property from the first week, the way small creatures follow warmth, asking questions, handing tools, getting underfoot in a way Brian never once seemed to mind. Kit was quieter, more watchful, and sat in the front row of Lorene's classroom every morning with a seriousness that made her throat tight with something she'd given up trying to name. One evening in October, she came home to find all 3 of them at the kitchen table. Brian was teaching Theo to sharpen a blade safely, hand over hand, patient and exact. Kit was drawing on a scrap of brown paper with his tongue between his teeth, deeply serious about whatever was taking shape. Lorene stood in the doorway. Brian looked up. Something in his face settled when he saw her, the particular settling of a man who has spent years bracing for things to go wrong and is still, day by day, learning they don't have to. "Beans are on," he told her. Theo helped. Theo looked like he had personally won something. She hung up her coat, moved into the kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and supper, and the particular warmth of a house that had people in it. She listened to the sounds around her, a boy's questions, a man answering without impatience, the steady scratch of Kit's pencil. "She has nothing to offer," they had whispered. She thought about Theo's face the first night she'd read to them both, how he'd leaned forward without realizing, pulled toward the story like it had a rope on him. Thought about Kit reaching for her hand on his first morning at the school, small fingers finding hers and holding on. Thought about 12 acres and a plain silver ring and a man who had walked out into the dark every December morning to split her wood finer and never once told a soul. She had everything. They had just never learned how to look. People in Caldwell Creek still tell the story of that March afternoon. The details shift depending on who's telling it. The ring gets described different ways, the light changes, the crowd at the door grows larger every year. But Agnes Pruitt, who was there and remembered everything exactly as it was until the day she died at 93, always told it the same. A quiet man in the dust, a woman with her hands over her face, a ring that caught the last of the evening light, and a town that learned something it should have known from the beginning, that worth isn't measured in what a person can give you. It's measured in what they're willing to build. Brian and Lorene built plenty, one ordinary day at a time, and every single day was enough.